Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. This is a very timely discussion, and it's interesting to see how the internet and internet policy have moved. It's always been important, but it's moved crucially to center stage in ways that, maybe we didn't expect at first. And so I'm lucky to have two of the people that I regard as true internet gurus on the panel today. Both played and continue to play a foundational role in creating the new technology. I'll start with Steve Crocker, who's the CEO of Shinkaro. Did I get the name wrong?
Good enough.
No, good enough, yeah. He's in the Internet Hall of Fame. Do I need to say more? His accomplishments are too long to list. So my favorite is the RFC, which when I knew something, I actually would occasionally do them. But with him is Becky Burr, a longtime expert on the internet. Again, one of the people who was foundational in creating it, and now a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. So thank you. And I also won't go over her career. She's done every possible thing, NTIA, FTC. We're lucky to have you both. Thank you for agreeing to do this. The format is just a conversation between the three of us on interesting topics. We'll see where we go. We have an hour. So let me start by asking you, back in 1995, 96, this is ancient history, I know. Did you expect what the internet was going to become? Did you, as you thought through this, did you think, and I'll start by saying I did not, it was, I think, 80 million people when I started working on it, and it was kind of like a big eBay with those 2D graphics. When you were thinking about the internet and its future back then, what did you think? Steve, do you want to start?
Well, my history goes back sort of twice that.
A little further, yeah.
To the beginnings of the ARPANET in the 68, 69, 70 timeframe. And so by the time we get to 95, it was already children who hadn't been born were now active. And so I get asked that question from time to time, sort of what were you guys, how did you have any idea, sort of that stumbling kind of question. What did you imagine? How are things working out? And the answer is extremely straightforward and simple. Everything is working out exactly on schedule, which is obviously a facetious answer.
I'm relieved to hear that.
An interesting, the more serious answer is actually a bit more subtle. So I was part of the team at UCLA, and more generally, we were part of the ARPA supported community. And an interesting element of that is that we were living in the future. We were all doing research on machines that were not commonly available to everybody. And so what we now have in our pockets and that we are using are things that we could actually envision and think about, even though they weren't available broadly. So there was graphics, there was hyperlinks, there was mouse and keyboard and so forth. But it would be quite some time before it was commercially available and that you could buy it for $1,000 and so forth. So quite a lot of what emerged, we could see pretty clearly. I mean, it was evident to me from the get-go that the idea of connecting computers was going to take off and that nobody would want a computer that wasn't connected. Even though computers in those days were big things. They were not things in your pocket. They weren't even portable. They were universities, businesses, and governments had computers. People did not have computers. But there's obviously quite a bit that we didn't see. I didn't anticipate Google exactly. We did anticipate speech. We did anticipate video and movies and so forth. But the rise of social media and personal Computers was, at least for me, every one of us, I'm sure, had our own view. So things certainly exploded well beyond anything we could have imagined in detail. But quite a lot of it was pretty obvious. It was just a question of when, and that's always the trickiest thing.
Great. Becky, how about you? You were there at the beginning as well. So as a child, of course, but
right. Thank you so much. But no, I wasn't at the technical beginnings, but really in the mid-90s when the commercial internet was really taking off. I think we were keenly aware of the potential for the internet to play an incredible role in the economy, in the delivery of goods and services and information. I used to joke that, you know, the hype on the internet was, you know, it was going to end world poverty and childhood diseases. And, you know, that was what people were saying. And that obviously was never true. And of course, you know, it hasn't, those were the things that we were concerned about, was understanding how much of the future was going to travel and traverse and live on this platform. The desire to think through the consequences of that and to support an environment in where all of the hype, to the extent that, you know, it was really related to the internet, could actually occur and take place. And so we were, you know, I think there was a do no harm, but affirmatively support the potential of this technology.
Both of you have been involved with ICANN, which was one of the innovations there at after the commercialization, 1995. ICANN sort of towards the end, when people realized that the old model didn't work for governing this thing. What are your thoughts on ICANN? And overall, ICANN used to be a hot topic, and when it was linked from your old home, delinked, a lot of the temperature went out of the room. So what are you thinking now about ICANN as a coordinating body? What do you want to tell us about that? Steve, we'll start with you because Becky just talked. But
so I always get a little nervous when words like ICANN and internet governance are put together with no qualifiers, because ICANN,
yeah, I am at a think tank.
ICANN's remit is over a very, very narrow and specific aspect, which is the coordination of the unique identifiers, basically. And nonetheless, even that sort of seemingly small topic has mushroomed and become very big. You know, one of the sort of qualities, both positive and negative, about the internet is that as it's grown, and it's grown enormously, it's grown, you know, tenfold and then tenfold and then tenfold and tenfold again. And so, you know, we're talking about a system that covers half the population of the world and is more than a million times bigger than the original networks that we built. You don't scale anything up like that without a lot of consequences and a lot of emergent problems. Things that were trivial or small or non-existent all of a sudden become dominant. So ICANN is an interesting invention. You know, both Becky and I have spent quite a few years involved with it. I'm not directly involved anymore, but I spent, I think, 15 years of my life, and including 14 on the board and 6.5 as chair. And Becky's been involved both on the board and before for a very long time. I'll let her speak to the details of that. And it's a really interesting and in many ways very successful organization that brings people together without the pre-existing structure of government. It's not a UN-based agency, yet it's global. It doesn't have the force of law, and yet it fills the space and does so, I think, very successfully of doing a lot of coordination. And at the same time, there's a lot of issues that are just very hard to reach conclusion on. And it's a kind of ponderous organization. So, from an engineering perspective of, where my background is, it can be quite frustrating. And on the other hand, in terms of bringing people together, boy, it does a great job of that.
Becky, how about you?
So, we used to joke that the goal of ICANN was to be boring, and that goes to that comment that Steve made about that remit, which is designed to be small, and it's not so much that the old system didn't work. It's just that the institutions that had sort of nurtured it were no longer fit for purpose. The commercial internet wasn't a science experiment anymore. And the National Science Foundation and DARPA were like, it's not our job. And so then the question is, what do you do to preserve the kind of energy, the kind of what we thought of then as the lack of ponderousness. And when your alternatives are a large UN agency or something else, we were committed to finding something that would allow the kind of energy, the kind of experimentation, the kind of iterative change. And it took a really long time, but I think it's quite mature. Steve is right, it's too ponderous, and that is something that we are still working on. I think it's probably not as ponderous as the ITU, but it's too ponderous. I have to say, I expected that what ICANN was to me was a kind of bridging institution in an increasingly globalized from an information perspective and a technology perspective world. And I did expect there to be more little ICANNs, right? So, the notion was that the remit would be small, but there would be lots more of these bridging institutions where people who were invested came together to collectively make decisions, and that things would move along because the remit for each one of them was narrow. ICANN still feels a little sui generis, even 22 years on, and I have to say that surprises me. But it's a very different institution than it was in 1998, and I expect 5 years from now, it'll be a pretty different institution than it is now.
Maybe broadening out a little bit from ICANN. ICANN used to be, and maybe still is, sort of the central point for the idea of multi-stakeholder governance. And that's always been questioned by some countries, but it seems to be under even more pressure now. And so you've got the IETF with people saying it needs to be replaced by some state-centric process. You've got IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, doing something with the UN and with states. So, what would you modify the multi-stakeholder model, or do you think it doesn't need to be modified despite all the pressure it's getting? I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
I'm going to let Becky go first.
What we haven't quite gotten right yet is a efficient decision-making model that brings people to the table to sort of compromise and get to yes, as opposed to stand in corners and take positions. That is what we really need to focus on. Now, I mean, there are pressures from sort of more state authority, but I don't think that they're about the thing that ICANN is really supposed to do. It's not ICANN's remit, it's coordinating these technical resources. The frustration and pressure is for ICANN to do more than it is actually permitted to do. And I don't think that that's a I don't think that's a design flaw. I mean, I do think that what we need is, again, the proper places to do other kinds of work. And ICANN cannot take on that role. And that's where I see the pressure coming from, is governments that want to have more centralized regulation and are frustrated that ICANN will not fulfill that role. And it's not ICANN's mission, and ICANN it has no legitimate basis for doing that.
Let me try to drive down a little bit into specific areas. You know, one of the consequences of the enormous growth of the internet is that it's not just gotten bigger, it also has a lot more complexity. So at the base layer, for example, you have the technical aspects. How do you move data from one place to another? How do you do it efficiently and reliably? And that's an enormous industry all by itself. You have ISPs and you have cable providers and you know, people laying submarine cables and building satellites and so forth. And then a whole different layer is the one that most people are familiar with, which is the content. You have the major information systems providers. You have the Googles and the Facebooks and so forth, and news organizations. And there's an entirely different set of issues, you know, at that layer. And a lot of the people who think of the internet think of it that way, whereas, you know, probably a smaller set of people, the ones that I grew up with, think of those are just minor applications that live on top of this platform that we built. And there's no way in the world, in my view, that you can have a single organization or even copies of the same type of organization that are appropriate for dealing with those issues from a governance or from a negotiation or engineering perspective. They're all significantly different. So it's a matter of identifying what the problems are and then designing the organizations to fit, as opposed to we have a one-size-fits-all organization model and everything has to fit into that. And so ICANN, as we've said, it fits into a very specific little narrow portion of that. But I'm always leery when somebody comes along and says, "Oh, we think this is great. We want an exact copy of." They don't say it quite like this, but the implication is you've solved the multi-stakeholder problem. We want to be just like you. You mentioned the IETF, which pre-exists, you know, predates ICANN by quite a bit, and it's a multi-stakeholder system. And if you don't capitalize any of the terms, and it's founded in an entirely different set of principles, and it's almost a burlesque relationship in the sense of you know, who can be a member of the IETF? Anybody. There are no such things as constituencies. There's no stakeholder groups. There's no policy development process. There is actually, it's now evolving more in that direction, but traditionally it was just a place for people to come and sort out technical things. It didn't have any contractual force, and yet very, very successful in the sense that people come together, put together technical decisions, and those decisions get adopted because they work. Wholly different model. So I like to be very cautious about which comes first. If it's sort of chicken and egg problem, you want to identify the problem set and what the dynamics are that are native to that area. And if you're tracking down porn or child abuse or fraud or political speech, that's an entirely different set of problems than how do you move packets efficiently from one place to another, and how do you solve the digital divide, so to speak.
So we were talking beforehand about some of the changes that are underway. And if I was going to look across the world, I'd say China appears to have a different vision of how the internet should work. Less concerning to me because, you know, China has so much baggage. We can talk about it later if you want. But the other place that's pressing for change is the European Union and the European Commission. And that's a little more interesting because one, we need them to be allies. And two, they've set themselves, or at least some of them have set themselves the goal of being the font of global regulation. When you talk to the Europeans, they point to issues like competitiveness and data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, even taxation, and say this is where the current system doesn't work. What would you say back to them?
Well, it's a mixture. There's certainly truth that there's a lot of problems. The core, there are two fundamental things. One is, as I said, when you bring along a technology that is as explosively, as explosive and as scaled up as the internet is, it challenges and changes the environment that everybody lives in. So you mentioned taxation, for example. So in the US, we have sales tax as a common mechanism for supporting local governments or state governments. And now you start tearing down the boundaries and you buy things on Amazon, and all of a sudden the support for local governments is challenged by quite a bit. There isn't any laws of physics that say sales tax necessarily is the right connection between commerce and the support for local governments. It's sort of an artifact that has grown up because it was convenient and relatively stable for a long time. Then it became unstable. And so now you got to rethink what the economics are going to be. These are human problems. These are not inherent, but they're tightly tied to the fact that you're using communication technology, except for the fact that the communication technology has changed the environment that we've all lived in. So I think it's vital to step back and separate these issues cleanly and think about them clearly. And it's hard because there's an awful lot invested in the status quo. And when the status quo stops working, that's very, very disturbing and challenging. And of course, everybody has their own answer as to what would work best from their point of view about this.
Great. Becky, you're sort of at the forefront of these issues in your current job. What would you say? I mean, I can go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, Steve is right. The current state of affairs is not entirely satisfactory. There are a lot of problems that need to be addressed. The question is a sort of top-down regulatory solution, centralized regulatory solution, the right way? Do we understand all of the consequences? Does it actually reflect the technology? And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that you can come up with a lot of regulatory schemes in the abstract that make sense, but that don't actually work with the technology, don't reflect the technology. I mean, in this country, we're having a huge debate about Section 230 and whether that's the continuing vitality of that. But I think that you have to, I think it would be very hard to argue that we would have achieved the kind of growth of user content and all of that kind of stuff that we have now without that. Now, does that mean it should be exactly the way it is forever? I don't know. I think it's worth having a conversation about. I tend to like to think more about sort of responsibility as opposed to regulation, and to think about it in those terms. What concerns me about these two big regulations that the European Union issued yesterday is that it is hard to imagine that they actually account for the kind of complexity that this technology, this platform actually has, the kind of complexity that gets added to it by the sort of human additions and the applications running on top of it. And it's not clear that a top-down single regulation is the way to get at all of those. I tend to be very skeptical about technology-specific regulation, and I can't think of a lot of examples where it's worked. And you know, I read there is something to, I have to say that the notion that getting out there first with a comprehensive top-down regulation is an advantage. It's a first mover advantage. And we know from the privacy context that is true. You know, California can create rules that become national rules because it has enough market power. The European Union has done that with privacy. And the US probably, you know, we missed an opportunity to have a sort of conversation about data protection because we didn't put a counter text out there. So I don't think that the right thing for the US to do necessarily is to simply say, no, 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 don't do it. I think we have to engage very specifically and be willing to think about the places where there are problems and whether there are, you know, sort of specific texts that that can be shared so that we can have a conversation about it. But there is, I think it's absolutely true that if these two directives are the only things that are out there, they're the only things we'll talk about. And so we need to think about engaging in a more constructive way.
I like your mention of California because it brings to mind two different factors. You mentioned market forces. California was the lead, took the lead in smog control, for example, and really had a first order impact on smog control regulations throughout the US and generation of cars generally. At the same time, the news of the moment is how many companies are moving out of California to Texas. And so one's got to be a little careful about how heavy-handed the regulations are.
Yeah, although you can avoid some smog rules by moving from California to Texas. It's much more complicated to avoid rules about data and sort of electronic commerce and that kind of thing. I mean, I agree with you. There's a potential for a backlash, but I think that we ignored at our peril and to our detriment the kind of traction that an idea that is appealing but not necessarily, and I'm not condemning all of it by any means. I'm just saying it is hardly intuitive to me that that it's easy to get this right, and that it's easy to catch all of the complexities and deal with them in the way that they have. So I agree with you, but I think, you know, this time around we should not ignore the fact that we need to engage in that conversation and globally.
Yeah, it's the intersection of Europe's desire for digital sovereignty, their desire to be the global standard setter for regulation of the internet, and really for at least some Europeans, a very different vision of how the internet should work that makes this an issue. But when you talk to companies like Facebook or Google or some of the other big tech giants, what they'll say is their fear, and I have mixed feelings about this, we have a business model that's basically you give data, they give you services at that level. And they're saying what the Europeans were doing will undercut that business model, will undercut the ability to innovate. Do you think that's a legitimate criticism? I mean, what's the concern? And when you talk to the Europeans, I talked to I know some of the people who wrote GDPR, and they said, no, we get it. Last time we messed up. This time we thought about innovation. Yeah, I know. What do you think? Is it sustainable to keep the old data for services model? Are the Europeans right? What's the alternative? What do you think?
And why is it we're having this discussion about Europe versus the US when China is sitting there with a quarter of the user population and an entirely different mindset about the rules for privacy and what the business models ought to be? This is a multiplayer game.
It is, but I think if the chances of China becoming the precedent setter are less than the chances of Europe becoming the precedent setter, right? And so when you look at GDPR's effect on California, when you look at the European interactions with the developing world, you know, I think they're a more serious contender. China has so much baggage. I mean, you know, they show up. We can talk about that in the whole standards battle, but I think if I was going to say which one is more likely to affect US policy next year, it would be Europe. So we can come back to China. In fact, we have a question from the audience about that. But my question is, the Europeans may not have thought through the economic effect of what they're doing. At least that's what some of the big tech companies say. Do you agree with that or what? I mean, the old model, I can remember being in, Becky, you were probably in some of them too. We had discussions about how would you pay for this thing when it wasn't NSF and DARPA anymore. And I remember there was a discussion at one point about micropayments, not feasible. And ultimately what emerged was this data for services model, and it's worked quite well, but there are some objections to it, so.
But I think data for services is a little too simplistic. Yes, it's true, but it also has to be responsible use of data in exchange for services. So it's not, you know, to the extent that there are problems with surprising, unexpected, or less than desirable uses of data, I think those things have to be addressed, which is why I was talking about responsibility. What I worry about in terms of this is that it strikes me as counterintuitive that you are going to increase space for innovation and increase space for startups and competition by imposing regulations that impose a lot of costs. That's what really worries me. There's that. I mean, believe me, I love all of the platforms, but if what we want is competition, and a heavily regulated environment is more likely to play into the court of the platforms that have the resources to till in the, you know, to play in that environment. And that's not startups. It's not innovative competitors. It's the big platform. So I think there's a real be careful what you ask for. Now, I don't know if that's what you're hearing from the platforms, but I mean, to me, it's just like, it's not likely to kill the platforms. It's likely to make it harder for competition.
If you want to get a good reaction next time you're at a European conference, say something like that. I think they would have lynched me if it hadn't been virtual. So, you know, and I'm not being entirely fair to them, but what advice, so they have these concerns, legitimate concerns, I'd say, certainly legitimate about privacy and data protection, which one of the comments we've gotten so far is that the Europeans see this as a fundamental human right more than as a commercial issue. But what advice would you give the Europeans when they talk about digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty? What advice would both of you give them when it comes to, frankly, rebuilding their tech industry?
I'm gonna let Steve go on first on that one.
Yeah, why is it appropriate for somebody sitting here in the US to give them any advice at all. I mean, that's presumptuous in a way.
Because I want them to succeed. Success meaning innovative, economically growing, strong partner in a transatlantic digital economy. So that's why that's why, just as an outside advisor, what would you tell them?
I'm going to push back a little bit.
Okay.
I'm not
Shocking.
I'm not expert in this whole area, but one of the things that I've heard over many years is that the employment rules are different in Europe. That you have a great deal more job security, and that has a big impact on mobility and ability to start things up. So that's completely independent of the internet. It's completely independent of Europe versus US, except that in the US, you have a great deal more flexibility in that sense. Well, they have a lot of benefits, a lot of social safety nets and so forth. And on the other hand, a lot of the innovations, a lot of the startups, a lot of the venture capital based activity is in the US as opposed to Europe. Not zero. I mean, but and I don't think there's anything new to say there that they don't know, and they can make their own decisions about that.
Becky, you have any views on that? I mean, they're talking about an industrial policy, so go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the participants has put Europe frames it as privacy as a human right, and the bigger picture is that the data economy imposes systemic social risks. That's absolutely true. The data economy imposes systemic social risks. The question is, how do you control those risks? And that's really the question that I think we have to think about hard. I mean, in the United States, we cannot have gone through the last, many months without understanding the social risks that we live in. And the question is, can you regulate your way out of those social risks, or do you have to do something a little bit? I mean, to me, I think that the way you control for the social risks is something that I would say the United States has to pay attention to. This is not shame my finger at Europe, but it's, we have to do better at educating people on those social risks, on learning how to read and understanding fact and separating fact from fiction, and that valuing science and all of those things. And that maybe the better way to control those social risks is to have a better educated citizenry. To me, and that I have to say, I'm just going to acknowledge this a particularly American perspective, right? We've never really thought we could control social risks by controlling speech, for example. Europe has a different relationship to that than we do, and it's a fundamental difference. I mean, it's very hard for me to imagine that we can control the social risks through a top-down regulatory regime in this environment with this technology, where the commodity is data and information, some of which is facts and some of which is not. So I think we need to think about, how we attack the digital divide and how we attack digital literacy, and ensure that we have that we have trained people to deal with those risks at a personal level.
Bringing up the issue of content control, 230 is on everyone's mind now, Section 230. At the time, I agree with you, it seemed like a good idea. We've seen things like the codicil to the Budapest Convention the US can't sign because of First Amendment concerns. what would you say about content control? Is there a direction we can move? I would say that the current situation is untenable, but the people who manage the big platforms may be moving in the right direction. But when you think about the 230 debate, what do you think? What would you recommend?
Well, I think that, we've seen a big swing in the pendulum from, it's 26 words that nobody thought was going to have the effect that they had. And it is something like 26 words, I think exactly. In the Communications Decency Act, where that Section 230 is all that's left, I taught e-commerce law for 4 years, and every year I would see 230 getting pushed farther and farther, and now it's kind of swinging back. So I do think that there's something, that there is a happy medium that permits, that facilitates user-generated content and does not make every platform responsible for user-generated content, but still obligates platforms to behave responsibly, to make sure that they're not facilitating violations of, fair housing laws, to make sure that they're living up to the promises and commitments that they make. So I think that there's I think that the pendulum is coming back now. We're going to have a debate, no matter, we're going to have a big debate on 230, but the particular debate that we were in, at least until the election, where it was, you don't like my content, therefore you're censoring it, is not a particularly productive way to go about this. What we ought to be thinking about is what the platform's responsibility is, and what we want to do, how far we should go to support speech. And again, this, the one of the directives is exactly, it has exactly the feature that says you're not, as an intermediary, you're not responsible unless you're told that there's something illegal, and then you must act. And the issue is illegal where, illegal in whose view, and does that drive people to take things down all the time? At which case you've got the opposite problem. So again, I think that there's an equilibrium here that we can get to, but I'm not sure that we have ideas on the table for doing that yet with 230.
I promise that we'll get to Steve's questions about China, but let me push back a little on that. I was at a dinner with a member of the European Commission, a commissioner, who said basically that, if you said things like that, because in Brussels, you would be mobbed, right? Because they're deeply unhappy over the issues of terrorism, over the issues of the far right, and they want something more. Do either of you think that's possible? I mean, what more is they haven't defined? I mean, their approach right now is to say, you figure out a way to control it or we'll fine you. That's not ideal, but what's the right answer to the Europeans, who I kind of share some of their concerns? I mean, they want more content control.
It feels, again, this is not the area that I've grown up in and dealt with a lot, but it feels to me slightly artificial in the following sense. We've got kind of two persistent problems that governments are struggling with. one is the generic problem of how do you foster effective interaction that leads to constructive solutions, constructive activities, without the baggage of a lot of destructive ones. And the other is slightly self-serving from a government point of view. How do you preserve the order and trust in government and institutions? And we don't have any good solutions for that. We have the rise of populism both here and in Europe and in various places. I think simple solutions probably are not going to cut it. I mean, you can imagine various draconian sorts of things, and usually those things historically lose twice. They lose because they're not effective, and they have a lot of backlash, which creates new problems. So it becomes a delicate problem. And these are sort of things that have been true about human population forever, and are just changing and morphing a little bit as we change the technology, but they're not, you know, we still are dealing with the fundamentals of the multiple forces that each of us as an organism embodies: competition, cooperation, and you know, the yin and yang of all that. I don't want to go too far off in that direction. So I think one has to be very careful. Obviously, the extremes are bad. I mean, you know, you don't want to have a lot of incitement for violence, and then you know, that has purely negative consequences. You know, Becky suggested education. I wonder how long we've been advocating that the population should be better educated. Pick your problem.
So Becky, maybe you could put your FTC hat on for a minute and give us some advice.
Well, I mean, look, I'm just as terrified, I think, as folks in Brussels are about what's going on here. And I think, you know, the answer is, again, it's a responsibility thing. Should the algorithms feed the same stuff to people over and over and over again? Should the algorithms try to interject some balance in information? It's very complicated to do. It would be a lot easier if there were competing platforms. And so I do think competition is a big answer. And I'm not an antitrust expert, but I do think that a more competitive environment would be helpful. But I also do think that the platforms are thinking about this issue of responsibility. They are thinking about the algorithms. They are thinking about sort of what their place in the world is. And I think that's very important as well. I mean, from a consumer protection perspective, you know, there are all of the tools of consumer, you know, of advertising that you can bring to bear here. I mean, we see that there's a lot of antitrust activity. It's going to be challenging because it's not clear that our competition laws were built in a data model, right? I think it's you know, we have to think about competition in a different way, perhaps. Steve's right, of course, that we've been talking about education as the solution to a lot of things for a really long time, and we haven't solved the education problem. I just think that, I guess the answer is, I guess where I come down is that, you know, if the solution that you bring to bear, content control, is either doomed to fail or doomed to create a different but bigger problem, then it's not going to help us. And content control again, it doesn't strike me as the most direct route to a solution.
Yeah. If we have time at the end, maybe we can talk a little bit about the tech giants and competitiveness and the whole issue, which I think isn't going to go away. But I did want to turn to China because it's the other place that I think is driving internet policy in a way that we might not like. The Chinese don't have a problem with content control, by the way. That doesn't mean their model is attractive to everyone, but they've made some good strides at capturing some of the multi-state entities. Capturing might be a little strong, but certainly when you look at their influence in the UN and the ITU and other places, it's grown considerably. So do you think China is a challenge? Do you think we're going to bifurcate the internet? I mean, what's your impression of what the Chinese are up to? Steve, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, you know, one of the observations is that, as you mentioned, the Chinese don't have a problem with content control. We hear a lot about the Great Firewall and all of the manpower that they put into observing and surveilling and controlling content. The other important fact, as I understand it, is that the population is quite comfortable with that as a whole, because it provides stability, and so they're more comfortable, at least as we hear, than we think we would be under that sort of circumstance, although one never knows what it would take for us to move into that kind of environment. And perhaps an uncomfortably large fraction of our population in the US would also be comfortable with that. Well, so these are sort of delicate and maybe unstable balance points. You know, size matters. We have, you know, you mentioned antitrust, you mentioned various other things, first mover advantage. When you have an enormous amount of money, when you have an enormous amount of financial power, you can stifle competition, and you can control the direction of things. The Chinese certainly are using their economic power, which is growing, and their organization to try to steer things in the direction they want. We have the same problem here with big platforms and the financial power they have. And at the risk of getting into political things, the lack of limits on how much corporations are allowed to contribute and spend on political forces shifts the balance away from one man, one vote to how many dollars can you amass and put into that direction. So that's a problem both internally in the US and globally. That maybe is the biggest issue about the dominance of large players and the ability to stifle innovation, the ability to stifle, or it doesn't stifle innovation exactly, it just controls the fruits of it. Like that, it's obvious.
Becky, what do you tell your clients about China?
Well, I mean, I think China is, it is a very, you know, it's a very big market and very attractive from that perspective, and a very big market and scary from that perspective in terms of, you know, enforcing a worldview or pushing worldview down. I don't think that there's any, I mean, you know, China's here. We have to deal with China. China is a competitor and a player, and I don't know. It's not putting aside the sort of the cybersecurity and the, you know, the espionage and intellectual property issues. That's kind of one big bucket. Other than that, I mean, yes, they have a big voice in the UN, and they are speaking more loudly, but you know, now I'm going to just show my own politics. We've sort of abdicated the stage for the past 4 years. There hasn't been a US voice in those spaces. We haven't been engaged in the conversation. That has to change, right? We have to be engaged in dialogue. And again, as I said, you know, we ignore European regulatory activity at our peril. We ignore, you know, stuff that China and Russia and Brazil and, you know, did name the countries at our peril. We need to be engaged in a conversation. We need to be part of the solution.
Yeah. I think the Biden administration has a huge opportunity, and I'm pretty confident that they know that and will take it, but it's going to be a lot of work to rebuild.
Yeah.
Huge.
Let me I see the question that's been lurking there for quite a while about asking for frank views on countries who want to split off or impose unilateral standards, which I take to be likely to be a reference to the Chinese wanting to have a different internet protocol. I haven't paid a lot of attention to it, but what attention I've paid to it confuses me, because it seems to be a mixture of a kind of uncomfortable mixture of a couple different things. One is some thought that they could do better technically at the basic level of reliability of transmission, cost of transmission, and so forth. And I think that's doubtful. And the other is as a vehicle for trying to gain control over content, which is an entirely separate matter, much along the lines we've been talking about. I don't think that we've seen any positive case to be made for needing a different basis for what the internet looks like at the fundamental level. I think that's just a flawed distraction.
Yeah, I haven't taken it that seriously because no one I talk to outside of China thinks it's a good idea. So we have a couple minutes left. We should probably say the words solar winds, just because it's that time of year. Any views on that? There's a whole sort of backroom operation to the internet that isn't visible to most consumers, and things like this surface every once in a while. What's your? I have to say I wasn't entirely surprised. What's your reaction to it?
I think it's pretty embarrassing. It really is quite frustrating how porous, how many holes we have in the systems that we buy and depend upon. There's been a huge amount of attention to trying to improve the quality of the software and the hardware systems that we buy, and yet the complexity just overwhelms. I've been an advocate for ever and ever that we ought to be raising the stakes quite a bit. And it's a whole nother discussion about what the state of the technology is for improving things, but it ought to become unacceptable for these things to have the kind of holes in them that we have. You know, the beginning of a long speech, suppose that elevators started dropping, people would say, gee, that's pretty terrible. We no longer can depend upon going into an elevator, yet you and I, when we were able to go into buildings that had elevators, don't think twice about it because the safety standards are there. When will we get to the point where you can trust the basic systems that we have? That's, I think that ought to be a major goal.
I was going to make a CMMC joke, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, but instead I'll give Becky the last word. What do you think we need to, need to think about?
I want to hear your joke someday.
Accountability. Yeah, I want to hear the joke too, but I think the answer is exactly what Steve said. It's accountability. I mean, yeah. You know, it's embarrassing, and yes, it's complex, but you know, this is basic, and has to be tackled at that level. And if the consequences for leaving these holes in begins to affect people, we will have fewer holes, or hopefully we will have fewer holes.
Well, this was a very sophisticated discussion, and I hope our audience appreciated it. It certainly was better than I expected. It was great, both of you. We covered a huge amount of ground. I could get away with that because you're both experts. Let me ask any final reflections on this topic before we close out. Steve, Becky, final remarks?
I think, I'm sorry. I think it's important in these things to take the very, very big topics that we're talking about and start to divide them into somewhat separate buckets in order to get a little more precision in these areas.
I agree, and I mean, I think it's what can I say? It's delightful to be having these conversations again. This is a critical time, and we need to do more of it.
Yeah, to end on a cheery note, I'm fairly confident, without being overly critical, that the next administration will do a better job on all these topics. But there are some hard problems. So thank you so much for joining us and for discussing them. This was so good. Maybe, you know, in 6 months or 4 months, we might want to think about a round 2. But thank you both for coming to CSIS virtually and talking on this topic.
Thanks for organizing it and inviting us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.